You can do everything right and still watch your food fail. Not a fancy device, not some high-tech irrigation rig. That is why the pipe matters, not because it is clever. Look at how absurd the modern routine really is. Kitchen scraps are carried away from the place they could nourish life. Compost is made somewhere else, if there is room, if there is time, if the smell doesn't become a problem. The first time you really see that, it changes the emotional weight of gardening. The shame starts to lift. Because if the old system requires constant buying, constant correcting, and constant rescue, then it is not resilience, it is managed exhaustion. What makes this feel like a scam is not just that it fails, it is that you pay for the failure in stages. First the yellow bag, then the balanced plant food, then the booster, then the emergency spray when the leaves curl. That is the part nobody says out loud at the garden center. Modern agriculture trained people to think fertility comes in a package, a number on a label, 3 letters, N, P, K, as if living soil can be reduced to the logic of fueling a machine. Look at the usual routine. You till because the ground feels hard. The tiller tears through fungal strands that took months to build, maybe longer. Those white threads aren't trash, they're trade routes, communication lines, moisture bridges. They connect roots to microbes, roots to minerals, sometimes even plant to plant. Then comes the synthetic fertilizer, fast and hot, flooding the soil with soluble nutrients. The plant takes a quick hit, greens up, looks impressive for a minute. And everybody calls that proof. But underground the message is different. Stop trading, stop partnering, stop feeding the biology. The system begins to shut down, because the plant no longer needs to spend its own sugars, recruiting allies. Then the weeds show up, because disturbed soil always calls in emergency species. So out comes the herbicide, or the safe weed control, or the landscape fabric, anything to keep the bed looking clean. But clean is often just another word for biologically empty. The surface bakes, the worms retreat, the fungi collapse. The microbes that buffer disease and cycle nutrients lose food, lose cover, lose oxygen balance. And then people wonder why the soil needs more inputs every season, just to produce the same mediocre tomato. This is the real trick. The industry sells the cure for symptoms caused by the last product: compacted soil from repeated disturbance, by an amendment, nutrient lockout from salt buildup, by a corrective feed, weak plants that attract pests, by a spray program, soil that no longer holds water because organic matter burned away. And microbial glues were wrecked, by a wetting agent, by moisture crystals, by more raised bed mix. You can spend an entire summer walking from shelf to shelf, purchasing substitutes for functions living soil used to perform for free. And the real theft is hidden below your feet, where you can't easily see the damage. A healthy root zone is supposed to smell earthy, soft, almost sweet after rain. It is supposed to be threaded with fungal life, lined with worm channels, armored with microbial competition that keeps disease from exploding every time the weather swings. That is soil immunity, not a product, not a slogan, a biological defense system. But when you hammer that system with salt fertilizers, bare ground heat, aggressive digging, and chemical weed control, you strip out the immune response and leave the plant standing alone. So when a bed keeps failing, it is not always because you forgot to feed it. Sometimes it is because you fed it the exact way the sales model required, in forms that bypass the underground relationships and slowly make the soil dependent on more outside inputs. That dependency is profitable. It is also fragile. Miss 1 week, skip 1 bag, get hit by a price spike. Suddenly the whole performance collapses because nothing underneath was rebuilt. And this is why worm castings are priced like some boutique luxury item. Because deep down, even the industry knows biology does something chemistry alone cannot. Castings aren't valuable just because they contain nutrients. They're valuable because they come wrapped in life. Microbial populations, stable organic compounds, enzymes, humus, structure, buffering capacity. They don't just feed a plant, they help restore the conditions where the soil can start feeding itself again. That is the crack in the whole illusion. If the most expensive fertilizer on the shelf is literally the waste product of a soil creature doing its normal job, then maybe the real question is not what to buy next. Maybe the real question is why we were taught to interrupt the workers, poison the system, and then pay premium prices to purchase back tiny fragments of what living ground creates on its own. Have you ever looked back at your garden receipts and realized you were funding the problem the whole time? What if the missing ingredient was never more fertilizer, but a living delivery system? Because the real law that got erased from modern gardening is simple. Plants don't eat in floods. In healthy ground, food arrives through traffic, exchange, and timing. A root leaks sugars, bacteria wake up around it. Fungi stretch like trading routes through dark soil. Worms drag bits of decaying matter down, grind them, coat them with microbes, and leave behind castings that act less like a chemical blast and more like a slow, intelligent release capsule. Nothing mystical. Picture a city under your feet. Tunnels, intersections, wet pockets, tiny bodies carrying carbon, minerals, and signals from one inch to the next. The plant isn't standing alone in dirt. It is plugged into a crowd. That is why synthetic fertilizer creates such a strange kind of hunger. It dumps soluble nutrients into the soil all at once. The way dumping a truckload of sugar into a hospital would technically count as feeding people. You get a fast reaction. Leaves surge, stems green up. Then rain comes, or irrigation runs, and a good portion of that nutrient pulse moves past the root zone, or burns out the microbial balance that should have been doing the delivery. The plant spikes, then crashes, then asks for another dose. But worm castings obey a different rule. Their nutrients are wrapped inside biology, and castings aren't just about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That is the old bookkeeping language. What matters is what rides along with them. Beneficial bacteria, fungal threads, humic compounds that change how soil feels in your hand. Sand starts holding moisture instead of shedding it. Tight, compacted. Earth starts opening enough to breathe. Now bring that underground city into one ordinary image. A plain pipe buried in the middle of a bed. To most people it looks ridiculous, like a plumbing mistake in a tomato patch. But underground it functions like a food port connected directly to the soil food web. Kitchen scraps go in, moisture holds. And this is where people overcomplicate what is almost embarrassingly simple. You don't need a gleaming system, a motor, or some branded garden gadget with a warranty card. A section of PVC pipe works. A cheap lidded bucket works. 4 to 6 inches wide is enough to hold meaningful scraps, without forcing you to feed it every day. But not so wide that the center turns into a dead pocket. The crucial part isn't the container, it is the openings. Before it goes into the ground, the lower portion gets drilled full of holes. Not one or two, not a decorative pattern. Plenty of them, scattered around the sides. Because you aren't making a sealed bin, you're making doors, doors for worms to enter, doors for moisture to balance, doors for microbes, airflow, and movement through the surrounding soil. The more pathways you create, the more alive the system becomes. Have you ever seen something this low-tech reveal a rule so big? It changes how you look at soil forever. The strangest part is how little you actually have to do. Not more labor, not more products, less interference. A plain pipe in the middle of the bed, open to the soil, becomes a feeding point, a meeting point, almost a doorway. Drill more holes and you aren't making technology more advanced. You're simply giving biology more entrances. More openings mean more worm traffic. More traffic means more castings carried out through the bed, not dumped in one dead pile, but spread slowly through the root zone, where plants can actually use them. And the bottom doesn't need engineering magic either. Leave it open, and worms come up from below, while the moisture from decomposing scraps seeps out into the surrounding soil. That dark liquid people pay for in bottles moves into the bed by gravity for free. If you're worried about clogging, a loose bit of mesh works. That is it, no motor, no timer, no complicated compost station in the back corner of the yard. Just one quiet opening, placed near the center, where every worm leaving that chamber has to pass the roots on its way through. This is the part that feels almost insulting once you see it, because the system isn't asking you to become a better worker. It is asking you to become a less disruptive one. Instead of turning, hauling, blending, and spreading, you drop the scraps where the underground workforce already lives. Wilted greens, apple cores, coffee grounds, banana peels, crushed eggshells, torn cardboard, the kind of things that usually leave your kitchen as waste, become a signal flare underground. Microbes begin the breakdown, worms detect it, they gather, they feed. Then they leave the chamber carrying fertility through the soil in their own bodies. But the real leverage isn't just in what you add, it is in what you stop adding. No greasy leftovers, no meat, no dairy, no heavy sauces, no chemical-laced trash pretending to be compost feed. Because the point isn't to stuff a tube with garbage. The point is to create a stable biological invitation. Clean, raw, plant-based material keeps the chamber attractive instead of hostile. Once that balance is there, the bed starts correcting itself. Moisture evens out, texture softens. The soil around the pipe darkens first, then loosens, then starts to smell less like dirt and more like a forest floor after rain. And that is when the trick becomes visible. The plants nearest the pipe begin to pull ahead. Not dramatically at first, just enough to make you pause. Leaves slightly larger, color slightly deeper. Growth a little faster after a hot week when everything else looks stressed. Then it becomes impossible to ignore. You realize the bed is no longer being fed from the top down. Like a patient on life support, it is being nourished from inside the ground outward, by movement, by appetite, by biology doing distribution far better than your hands ever could. Most people ruin this not by neglect but by enthusiasm. They overfill the pipe. They think if a little is good, more must be better. But if you dump in more scraps than the microbes and worms can process, the chamber shifts from alive to sour. The smell tells on you first. That sharp, swampy, rotten note isn't composting success. It is a traffic jam underground. The fix is wonderfully unglamorous. Feed less. Wait longer. Let the system catch up. That is the forgotten bargain here. You give the soil a small, steady offering, and in return, it starts performing work that looks almost supernatural. If you were trained to expect results only from store-bought inputs, a cheap pipe, a few holes, maybe even less than that in other beds, cardboard laid flat to calm weeds and hold moisture, a pile of leaves left where they fall, a trench of woody debris, buried and forgotten. These aren't heroic actions, they're humble nudges, yet they trigger entire chains of life that no bagged product can replicate. So if your garden has felt expensive, exhausting, or weirdly dependent on constant rescue, maybe the answer isn't to try harder. Maybe it is to build one small doorway and let the soil come back to work. If you had to choose just one lazy change this season, that might wake your ground up. What would you test first? And this is where the whole thing stops being about gardening, because the real payoff isn't a prettier bed, or a bigger tomato, or the smug satisfaction of saying you made your own fertilizer. The real payoff arrives on a bad week. A week when shelves look thinner than usual, when lettuce suddenly costs 3 times what it did a month ago, when trucks are late, stores are picked over, and people start doing that quiet math in their heads at the checkout line, putting one thing back so they can afford another. That is when a simple pipe in the soil reveals what it really was all along. Not a trick, not a hobby, but a tiny piece of sovereignty. If the chamber ever turns foul, if you lift the lid and get hit with that sharp, rotten smell, the system is telling you exactly what it needs. Less wet waste, more dry carbon, a handful of torn cardboard, a layer of dry leaves. Then you step back and let the underground workers correct the balance. That detail matters, because it proves something bigger. You aren't forcing life to happen. You're entering a contract with processes, older than agriculture itself. You feed them what your kitchen was already discarding. They return fertility at the root zone, quietly, continuously, without invoices, branding, or dependency. That is what makes this so dangerous to the machine that profits from your insecurity. A system that takes peels, coffee grounds, trimmings, stale crumbs, and turns them into plant nutrition right where it is needed, doesn't fit the business model of annual dependence. It asks for almost nothing. It can't be patented in any meaningful way. It doesn't flatter you with shiny packaging. It doesn't need you to believe you're helpless without a seasonal purchase. It just works, underground, while the marketed world keeps shouting. And once you really see that, the emotional center shifts. You stop asking, "What fertilizer should I buy this spring?" and start asking, "How much of my household waste can become tomorrow's food?" You stop seeing your yard as decoration and start seeing it as resilience. The bucket under the sink, the cardboard by the door, the leaves nobody wanted to rake. Suddenly these aren't scraps and chores. They're inputs, reserves, quiet insurance. Picture the contrast clearly. One household is driving from store to store because the produce section has been stripped bare. Prices are up, quality is down, and everyone is grabbing whatever still looks edible. Another household walks outside in old shoes, lifts a lid, drops in the day's scraps, then comes back later with dirt under the fingernails and an armful of actual food. Or they go down to a cool shelf, a cellar corner, a crate in the dark, and pull out onions, squash, jars, potatoes, garlic. Food that began as living soil instead of a barcode. Same crisis, same week, completely different posture. That difference is dignity, not the fantasy of total independence, not chest-thumping survival theater. Just the deeply human relief of knowing that part of your life is no longer held hostage by a fragile chain of trucks, shelves, and price spikes. When other people are panic buying, you're harvesting. When they're arguing over what is left, you're cooking what you grew. Even a small bed changes the psychology of scarcity. A few reliable systems change it more. They remind your body that food doesn't start in a store. It starts in relationships between scraps and worms, fungi and roots, water and carbon, patience and season. So if this idea felt strangely bigger than a compost pipe, trust that feeling because it is bigger. When the next disruption comes, I know which scene I'd rather be living in. The shopping cart with too little in it, or the back door opening onto food. What would make you feel more secure first? One pipe in a bed, one crop you can store, or one corner of your yard turned into a food reserve.